Good morning or afternoon, depends on whether you're US or UK. I'm both, so I'm really not sure what it is, but it's after 12. For me that's afternoon. I think it's still morning in some of my nationalities. I'm Cynthia Weber. Welcome to this Research Hive activity. Thank you everybody for coming. Before I introduce the event for today, I want to just tell you a little bit about what's coming up next. Unusually, I understand, for this seminar series, we'll be meeting on a Tuesday rather than a Thursday, the 1st of March, at the same time, 12 to 2. And that event will be about funding your research, scholarships, grants, and contacts that enable your research. Our speaker for that will be Professor Michael Davies, who's the Pro-Vice Chancellor here at Sussex for Research. So I'm sure we'll have lots to say about that. And Kitty will be chairing that session. So mark your diaries. Today, I have the pleasure of chairing a session on responsible self-promotion, reaching new and expanding readerships for research. Our two speakers today are Alison Phipps, who's in the Sociology department, and Tim Hitchcock, who is in History and the Humanities lab. You may know of their work, and maybe that's why you've come here today. That's why I would be on that side of the table if I hadn't been asked to be on this side of the table. Alison has written a lot on lad culture, gender in public conversations, the reception of women and feminists when they take the pose of the public intellectual. And today I understand she's going to be speaking generally about public intellectuals. Tim has the, I think, provocatively named blog Histrionics. So I'm expecting he thinks of it as splicing and dicing all those things that don't necessarily go together. I like the melodrama of it. We'll see how those two things combine. Some of his research, he does lots of things on the uses of social media. Some of those are about the public perception of research projects as opposed to the research projects themselves. So I think his comments will cover that range of topics. We've asked our speakers to speak for about 10 to 15 minutes. They've both said they think they're going to speak in general terms, but then we'll open it up for discussion, and they're very happy to speak about specificities at that point. So I'll turn it over to Alison first.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. I have to say I was a bit uncomfortable about coming and talking on this topic, because I don't really consider myself to be a self-promoter. I wondered why you invited me. Two of the most shameless self-promoters in the university we must be. So I got a bit stuck on the title of responsible self-promotion, and I ended up kind of thinking in quite abstract and quite conceptual terms about what that means. So what I say now, you might kind of think, I just wanted some tips on how to use Twitter, and I can give those afterwards. That's fine. But what I wanted to do is just to unpick that title a little bit and think about what it means. And the phrase for me, responsible self-promotion, I think is probably a bit of an oxymoron, to be honest, because responsibility implies being accountable to something other than yourself, and the act of promoting the self is, by definition, selfish. So I started asking myself, is it possible to both promote the self and be accountable to the other? And I think the answer is probably not. But I know that self-promotion is increasingly part of our lives as academics. So our readerships and our research impact are metricized by the systems of reward and punishment that our funding streams, league tables, and the ref. For early career researchers, and I think there are a few of those in the room, precarious employment depends on being able to narrate the self in marketable fashion. And for those in mid to late career stages, like Tim and myself, promotion is often reliant on self-promotion. So rising up the ranks means evidencing, usually for a committee, your cultural, political, and intellectual reach. So I started to wonder how we negotiate these demands for exposure in appropriate and sensitive ways. And I start from the position of my work, and I'm a social researcher. So my work is to generate socially useful knowledge with a number of others. And in my recent projects, those are women and people of other genders who are all trying to navigate the challenging context of contemporary higher education. Many of these people are survivors of discrimination, harassment and assault. Some are working in the sex industry to pay their fees and maintenance. Many of these people are vulnerable, some are socially marginalised, and almost all of them tell me things about their lives which are difficult or uncomfortable, and they trust me to narrate those things in thoughtful and appropriate ways. So this is an intimacy between self and other, which also comes into play when I think about the act of promoting my work. So first of all, to promote this work as mine means to devalue the work that these others have put in, which is time, emotional labour, the co-production of ideas through long and in some cases repeated conversations. And to promote this work as mine also means often being asked to speak for or to speak over the other. So if I want to be responsible in my self-promotion, I need to honour that relationship between self and other. I need to be also mindful of the boundary between myself and my, or more appropriately, our work. And this involves thinking very carefully about the role of the self in what is being promoted. It also means seeing the other as broadly defined, so it's not just about my particular research participants, it's about the communities and the groups that they represent. Anybody who works in the humanities or social sciences will know that there are important ethical and political questions about who owns different forms of knowledge, and also about who gets to speak that knowledge in the public realm. And as my work has entered different publics, so academia, policy, civil society, the media, I've found it more and more necessary to be clear on exactly what I'm offering, but also what am I being asked to give. So am I claiming ownership of something which is not really mine to possess? Am I being asked to speak to the work, or am I being asked to speak for or over the other? And so to consider these questions, I found it useful to make distinctions between the work of specialist research and the general issues affecting the populations that I create knowledge with. I might understand my project of data collection better than anyone else in terms of its rationale, its methodology, its ethics, its data analysis, but even the most detailed ethnography is only a snapshot or a freeze frame in a broader production. So my work does not give me comprehensive insight into the deeper and broader realities and experiences of the groups with whom I study. Of course, these boundaries are quite permeable, and many of the topics that I study I have lived through myself. But my experience is not someone else's, especially if I'm in an advantage because of my social position or because of my institutional location. As a professional researcher, I'm very rarely a community insider, so I shouldn't set myself up to speak as one, especially not over people who are more than able to speak for themselves. So being responsible for me partly means focusing on the work and not letting the demands of the self lead me to sideline the other. I don't always manage this, it's hard, but I'm learning to ask myself, should I occupy this platform or should I get out of the way? And as the platforms get bigger and more elevated, questions about self and other get louder and they get more urgent. And the relationship between myself and my work, or our work, also becomes more problematic because having a public profile means it's more and more likely that you'll be asked to comment on issues and areas which are only adjacent to your specialism. So the self begins to grow and you start to be seen as an all-purpose expert, a talking head who can offer opinion on matters only faintly connected or sometimes wholly unconnected to the work that they do. You are becoming a public intellectual. So who is this public intellectual? Well, he's usually, but not always, a man. More often than not, he's white and middle class and occupies other positions of privilege. Tim's sitting there going, it's you. This is not about Tim. This, of course, reflects continued structures of inequality and the dynamics of visibility and invisibility in academia, in the media, in politics, etc. The public intellectual is normally of a certain age, having built his profile over the course of a career. And now he's arrived, His portfolio is broad, covering areas of which he may have little or no academic knowledge or experience, because he embodies expertise. So expertise literally resides in his physical and intellectual presence. And for Marx, this was a good thing. The intelligentsia were the source of progressive ideas for the work of social transformation. But there are obvious power dynamics in this, not least that it positions the other as part of a rank and file that needs to be educated and does not do the educating. We are often asked to accept public intellectuals as inherently progressive and not in need of educating. But I was asking myself, is this really the case? And I was considering the case of the famous zoologist and infamous atheist who recently said to hell with their culture in a chat show discussion about Muslims. He's also made statements on the immorality of failing to abort a fetus diagnosed with Down syndrome and statements on how some rapes are worse than others. He's offered commentary on transgender rights, some of this in support of a prominent radical feminist intellectual whose chat about trans women is worthy of a Daily Mail headline writer. She has actually confirmed that trans issues are not her intellectual focus. Nevertheless, she has not felt unqualified to comment. This willingness to claim unfamiliar territory also brings to mind for me the famous political philosopher who led the support for Julian Assange and who saw the rape allegations against him through an anti-establishment framework which was devoid of gender analysis, because that's not what he does. For me, these are cautionary tales, and they're tales of what can happen when the public consumes the intellectual in all sorts of ways. Contrary to the idea of the superstar scholar with privileged insights into almost all areas of life, the social privilege of these public intellectuals is often what leads them to misunderstand and make mistakes in relation to marginalised communities. And when the self displaces the work like that, the other is not only forgotten, but is spoken over and oppressed. And of course, this is not how the public intellectual sees it. To him, he is being oppressed by a rabble of oversensitive students and identity-obsessed keyboard warriors who are agitating against his speech. His voice is remarkably loud for somebody who's being silenced. So debates about whether such public intellectuals should be allowed the right to unfettered speech tend to overshadow concerns about prevent, about crackdowns on student protest, about the planned criminalisation of boycotts and divestment policies, and other very real threats to academic and political freedom. I am not a public intellectual, I don't think, and I don't want to become one, but I do share some of their privileges, not least the privilege of being offered and granted platforms on a regular basis. I've also, on many occasions, found myself in a position of being asked to speak for or over the other as part of discussions about my work. Too many times I've slipped up and done it. And this makes me question myself, it makes me question my work, and it makes me question what it means to promote either of them. So I ask myself questions. What is it responsible for me to talk about? How far should I stray beyond my own areas of expertise and the research work I have done with other people? What are the boundaries between discussing this research, offering my opinion, and ventriloquising other people's experiences? I need to ask these questions, and I need to ask them consistently to improve my academic and political praxis. I need to be mindful of the relationships between self and other, and of the boundary between myself and my work. I'm not sure that there's such a thing as responsible self-promotion, but if there is, I hope that this is how it starts. And that's all I have to say. I'm sorry it was not very practical. Thank you.
Okay, well, that was fantastic.
Oh,
thank you. And I agree with all of that, you know, and I frame this much more in a kind of practical sense in terms of how one might actually promote the projects that are at the core of what we do as academics. But that fundamental conundrum between ego on the one hand, all those invitations, that opportunity to speak about stuff you know nothing whatsoever about, and also is at the core of what I think is where most academics actually fall down in terms of responsibly engaging with a broader media. And it's something I think we just need to keep very much to the fore in thinking about how we actually might strategize to use the media. Because we got to remember as well, let's face it, the media is not our friend. They aren't here to promote our work. They aren't here because they think we're wonderful people. They're here precisely to get profit, to create a story for themselves. And our engagement with that, I think, is really problematic. Having said that, thankfully, from my perspective, all the people I work on are dead. They're very dead. They're 200 years dead. And that doesn't relieve me of responsibility for them. It doesn't relieve me of the responsibility to speak with a clear voice. But it does mean that my relationship to them, is different and ends up being much more focused on an essentially contemporary political debate in a broader public sphere. It's not necessarily about representing live people or arguing with a live group of people as trying to find voices that one can use in the present. I work on history from below. Histories of how to beg on the streets of 18th century London, histories of sexuality and masculinity in the 18th and 19th century, and most importantly, what I try to work on is the creation of empathetic histories written from the bottom up. All, if like, engage with that idea of how do you actually speak to an audience, to ventriloquize for a long dead community in a way that actually is compelling, that can draw an audience in, that can, if they like, shape how they think about human relations more broadly. And as part of this, I work to create publicly available web resources that make the underpinning evidence of that path, that empathy, freely available to critical mass. I've spent the last 20 years putting, I don't know how many billions of words of text online precisely for that. And I do that because it is about a absolutely self-conscious engagement with a wider public. But both the web resources and the writing, the kind of traditional academic writing, reflect a simple belief that society works better, that it can interrogate and challenge its own past, and that in the conversation, the silent and disregarded do need a voice, even if they are long dead. In other words, for me, the past is both a sounding board for the present, and that it needs to make as much noise as possible in the present. And for the purpose of this afternoon, that noise is the problem. Because for all the fact that impact is important, it's important that our work get out there. It's important that it informs a wider discussion about how society works and where it comes from and where it's going from. But the moment you make that leap, the moment you say, yes, impact is important, yes, we need to be there, yes, we need to be on a Today program or wherever it is, two questions leap to mind. First, how do you get that attention of a wider audience? And second, how far can you go before your work and their voice is simply co-opted into some weird media circus? If you like to paraphrase the title of the session, how do you play with the media without getting hurt? And all of that leads me, anyway, to ask, who do you choose to engage with? How do you actually identify the appropriate venues for that? When do you turn out, when not to be available? Which emails don't you answer as much as which emails you do answer? There's a tendency for us to constantly jump at the ring of a phone, jump at any email from some ridiculous journalist. When is a late night deadline for a bit of public writing not worth meeting? And after some 20 years, during which, and I think this is a measure of pride actually, my work has been plagiarized by every sector of the British media, from the BBC to the National Theatre to newspapers, more than I can recollect. I should say that plagiarism compensation actually forms about a third of the income for ongoing projects that I've been involved with in the last 20 years. And they're very generous. So you just write a nice email and they put the check in the post. I have both gradually developed my own media strategy, largely by happenstance, and come to the conclusion that most projects actually benefit from a much more explicit strategy from the very beginning. And we really need to up our game in terms of our relationship to that broader medium. And I suppose where I end up is with just a few thoughts. First, it seems to me that in the context that we are now in which we are now working, we really do need multiple platforms. We need to control all the different platforms, from Twitter to blogs to Facebook, to how we then engage with all the different types of print and other forms of media. This is about building a community of interest, of controlling that community. And, not controlling, but building a community of interest that actually share your values and share your interests. And it should be integrated into project planning from the very beginning. Unless we reach out and make an academic project, a social project, then we're going to lose control of it. We will simply produce stuff that will be consumed somewhere else. It's also important not to separate out the work involved from that wider project effort. It seems to me that one needs to use tweets to have an academic conversation. You need to storify the tweets that you create in order to create an archive of that conversation. You need to create street teams of meetings and workshops and work those into blog posts and use the whole lot to identify your audience and to develop the ideas that form your next article or your next book or the next step in that process of engaging with a wider audience. And the point about this, and I think of it as kind of performing the academy in public, is that you build an audience as you do the work. And you do so in dialogue. But that's just a small part of what seems to me a wider and more self-conscious program of work. So in parallel to that performance, it seems to me that it is actually incumbent upon us to go out and identify the communities who should be listening, who we do want to engage with, to actually have a policy for how we find who we want to talk to and figure out a strategy for meeting them. I always say, we should use Twitter to stalk those communities ever so gently. So that's probably a terrible metaphor, and I have to apologize for it later. We also need to identify moments around which publicity can actually be generated and build it up through the social media. I mean, every conference and publication should have a press release. It can be sent out at a sensible time, written with a clear sense of what it will be used for. Give journalists 3 talking points and the best examples you can, and they will reproduce it endlessly in very much the same language that you give it to them. Journalists are lazy, and they are not looking to engage in a conversation. They are looking to create copy. Make yourself available, yeah, but know when not to be available. And to the extent you can, try and own that process. And it's that ownership, that sense that we aren't simply public intellectuals, seeking new venues, but actually people with serious purpose trying to make something happen. A conversation, a policy change, a public engagement, empathetic understanding of the path, whatever. And remember, all that is work, just like any other kind of work. We tend to underestimate it because we don't we don't cost it. It's not somehow on your APW, your school teaching program. It's not an add-on though, but a direct component of that larger process. So build the work into your grant application. Set aside time for Twitter and blogs and recognize the basic fact that if the media is just one more component of that neoliberal regime, then the balance between them and us is important. We need to take what control we can and actually be aware of what it is we want to put out there. And my advice is simply to recognize that most journalists are incredibly lazy. They're just normally lazy. They are not looking for a story, and that if we give them what they need, then we have actually the power to shape that. On the responsible bit, I guess I can most easily illustrate the pitfalls with a couple of examples. And these basically come from instances, now going back a couple of decades, where I've just been burned. And I've been burned precisely because of the issue of ego, the issue that, oh my God, maybe I'm telling, the issue of, oh my God, somebody will recognize me as somehow that public intellectual weirdness. And there are instances which have left me not so much burned as hopefully wiser. And the first happened quite a while ago, but I think actually remains typical and is an example of the extent to which the media is not all respected. At the time, I was publishing a lot on the history of sexuality in the 18th century, and the producer got in touch with me. And he wanted me to appear on a documentary, which is what he called it, on Casanova. I was complimented, and I agreed, without thinking too much about it. And I arrived, as commanded, on a Sunday afternoon at the Institute of Directors on Pall Mall. I don't know if you know the Institute of Directors at all, but it is a gorgeous 18th century building, one of the best preserved symbols of the establishment you could possibly find. And of course, what I found out the minute I walked through the door is that they had actually bribed the guards to let them in on Sunday to do the filming without any kind of permission from the Institute of Directors. It was essentially a fly-by-night organization of the worst kind. And as that afternoon progressed, the problems began to emerge. Not only had they bribed the guards, but they clearly wanted me to stand there and give them a story of Casanova, the great lover, that they could then use. And of course, anybody who's read anything about Casanova knows he's a rapist and a child abuser and the worst kind of exemplar of enlightenment bastardy you could ever want. And that was, there was immediately a huge conflict. And we went for 3 hours back and forth. Finally, I got out of there, and he had a wad of 20-pound notes, the size of my fist, and he was peeling the money off. Unfortunately, I was left out of the final version, which was essentially a soft porn documentary that went out on all the wrong channels. But it did. And this is now 20 years ago, and it really did leave me with a very strong sense that the media need to be treated with real care. But they aren't there, as I said before, to help us. They're there to help themselves. And the other event that left me equally bruised was the launch of the 19th century component of a website I run called the Old Bailey Online. It gets a lot of usage internationally. And it got worldwide publicity. And it got worldwide publicity on just the sort of press release that I advocated writing for every project, for every moment in that. And the only problem was that in our eagerness to garner attention, we included a statement that Oscar Wilde's trial was included among the trials in the Old Bailey Online. And that was entirely true. But the version was 3 lines of censored material of no interest whatsoever, whereas all the details of the trial were in the newspapers. So as a result, what we ended up doing is actually creating a false expectation that in turn came back to bite us really hard. If only because 300 journalists all wanted us to explain the trial of Oscar Wilde on the back of this, and we're looking in the wrong place. And it just brought home to me, except not only do I don't trust the journalists, I also don't trust myself. All of which is really designed to make 2 points. First of all, that we really do need to be careful, and that we ought to try to avoid being stupid, which I think seems to be a good thing in general. In my experience, most academics are ridiculously vain, ridiculously self-important, including myself. The media gives us the promise of attention and glory, of that opportunity to perform the role of public intellectual. And the impact agenda, brought in from on high, makes us anxious consumers of what scraps they throw in our direction. We are pushed both by our own egos and by the system to misstep, to put ourselves too far out, to not control what the message is we really want to convey. And too often, we trade our legitimate and serious interests for that scrap of public attention. For this purpose, it seems to me that it's absolutely necessary that we put our egos aside, remember what's important, and be willing to both deliberately work to shape a story, be self-conscious about shaping a story, and be equally willing not to answer an email for a version of that story you don't like. Thanks.